So this is an informational video on how to solder the capacitor and wires to any of the provided motors in your kit. Okay, so to begin soldering your motor together, or at least the pieces to the motor, let's go ahead and make sure that we have all of the pieces to the right size. So you're going to take your capacitor and actually trim off the leads because you don't want them sticking out way too far. So you're going to take the clippers and figure out about how far apart you need them by looking at the tabs on the motor and figuring out how far down you want them to be. So right about here looks like a good spot. So I'm going to trim my leads to that position, making sure to use some very sharp trimmers. 1 and 2. And the reason you trim them before you solder them to the motor is because if you trim them afterwards, you'll stress out the solder that you just did and potentially break it. So you can bend out the leads gently to the capacitor. See how they match up nicely. And in this case, the motor has these little round tabs so that you could actually stick the leads in there to give yourself a helping hand. So the next thing we'll want to do while prepping all of our materials is strip the ends of our wires. So make sure you have enough wire that it will reach your motor to the control box, wherever it is on your machine. So let's go ahead and trim off or strip off this end of the wire, and you really only need maybe about a ½ inch or less of the wire to be stripped. You don't need a whole bunch, because what will happen is you might accidentally have those leads touch and then it will short out your machine, which isn't good. So in this case, we've provided you 16 gauge wire, so use the 16 gauge wire hole, and then you can just stick it in and clamp down and strip off. So now we have one stripped wire. Let's go ahead and do the same thing for the black one. Stick it in the 16 hole, make sure it's about the right length, and pull off. And that's it. Sometimes it might be a little difficult, but just keep pulling at it. There you go. No, stop it.
Here we go.
Okay, so here's the soldering station. And in your soldering station you should have your soldering iron, a wet sponge, as well as some steel wool. And the purpose of the steel wool is to clean off the tip after every use. Same thing with the wet sponge, is to just gently clean off the tip. It's pretty warm. So you want to make sure to set your soldering iron to the correct temperature. In this case, I made it 700 degrees. And rub off the tip a little bit. And actually you want to tin the tip. I know that sounds a little counterintuitive. Why did we just clean the tip and now we're applying solder to it? But it actually helps to conduct the heat through the solder. So go ahead and just touch, barely touch a little bit. Now the fumes that you see coming off are actually the flux inside the solder burning off. It's not necessarily the lead smoking off. So don't breathe these fumes deeply, but don't be nervous that you're going to get lead poisoning from this little itty bitty bit of solder. So before we actually start soldering, there's one thing that you have to do, and that is to prime your pieces. So let me put my soldering iron up. And go ahead and prime your pieces using the flex pen provided in the crib. Just gently tap those areas. And what the flux does is it deoxidizes the area and cleans it. Flux does not apply, or I'm sorry, not flux, solder does not apply very well to pieces that are dirty or have rust on them. So just gently apply it to these areas, as well as the areas of your capacitor, these ends. There you go. So now we can insert these leads like I was saying before to get them in position. There we go. Okay, so now we're ready for the actual solder. So we prepped our tip and we cleaned it. So let's go through and take the solder and actually apply it to the leads. So here you don't want to apply the solder to the iron and then try and transfer it, because it's not going to transfer very easily. So what you actually want to do is heat up the components that you are trying to solder. So in this case, it will be the leads as well as the capacitor leads. And you want the solder, as you can see here, I don't have the piece cut off, I actually have it on the roll, that way it's easier to hold on to. You want the soldering iron to be on the opposite side of where the solder is. So I actually have my soldering iron just below the tab instead of on top of the tab. So you're going to heat up these pieces and you're going to see this flux starting to burn off, which is good. And I'm starting to get the shaky jakes. There you go. So you can see that the solder is starting to melt off and onto our lead, which is good. There we go. And what you want to do first is pull off the solder and then the soldering iron. And don't worry, I'll show you on the other side as well. So let that cool off. And be careful because your components might be a little hot to the touch. Make sure to get all your other components in the right area. You can always go back and apply flux if you've touched these areas. There you go. And now let's do the same thing. By having the flux on the one side and the solder on the other. Now if you see that you're not able to make the connection, go ahead and pull everything off and try and rearrange your components. So in this case, my capacitor actually came out of its little loop, so it wasn't going to solder correctly. So I went ahead and repositioned it into the little loop. If you have any questions while soldering, go ahead and ask the GSI on duty. They've all been trained in soldering techniques, so they'll be able to help you out. So now that we have it repositioned, let's go back and touch the sides. You can see the solder is starting to melt off. Very good. And pull off the solder, pull off the tip, and you've got your capacitor soldered on. Now you shouldn't have a ton of solder blobbed all over. It should be a very neat little solder. So as you can see here, I just got the tab soldered to the capacitor, and it's all connected. You can see that the solder actually goes through the little tab and onto the other side, which is good. So now we have our capacitor soldered in. Now it's time to do the wires. Now that you've done this, go ahead and clean off your tip. Use a little bit of water, use a little bit of steel wool, scrape it all off. And when you're cleaning your tip, actually use a side-to-side motion like this to help scrape it off instead of just sticking it in, because that does nothing. So side-to-side motion. A little tiny bit of solder to tin the tip. And let's keep going with our wires. So put that back in the holder and apply flux to our wires. And you only need to apply flux to one side because you're not soldering both ends. So now in this case, it might be helpful to have a friend to hold the wires in place, or we have holding stations that you can also use. So in this case, I'm just going to lay it right there, and it should work out all right. So I'm going to bring the soldering iron on the other side of the, actually I'm going to turn this around so y'all can see. There we go. Make sure that the wire is touching all of the components. There we go, just right. And go ahead on the underneath of the wire, like we did before, and make sure to get that solder on there. Now if things aren't heating properly, which they aren't right now, it might be the case where you don't actually have enough solder or enough flux on that component. Or you just might have to be patient and keep holding the soldering iron onto that component. So that was the case here. Is it just wasn't being held onto the component long enough. But once you just sit there and hold onto it, I was able to apply the solder. So as you can see here, it's nicely dabbed on. I don't have too much, and I can see that the wires have been soldered to the tab as well as the capacitor component. So that's that wire. Let's go ahead and do the same thing for the other side. Cleaning tip. Go ahead and tin the tip. Just a little tiny bit of solder, not too much. Let's put it back in the stand while we apply the flux to the end of the wire. The nice thing is this is a little pen, so you can just kind of draw on the flux. You don't need too much, but you do need to make sure that you have all the components nice and wet with this flux. So let's do the same thing on this side. You can cheat and bend the wires so that it touches in the right area. Now we have our soldering iron. Pull out enough solder and begin. So once again, don't get discouraged. The wires take a little bit longer to heat up, so you just have to be patient and let them heat up so that you can apply the solder. So there we go. And now we have our complete components. Okay, so we finished soldering all of our components together, and as you can see, I actually went ahead and bent the wires. The next step to do is to take a piece of tape, electrical tape, or better yet, take some zip ties and actually zip tie these wires to the motor body. And what this will do is it will create slack in these wires so that even if we pull on this side won't be pulled on, and so our nice soldering job won't crack.